This is the Debunking Economics podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
The archives.
Episode 173, Making an MMT Green New Deal Global.
Welcome to the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. And last time, we spoke about Larry Randall Wray's suggestion that modern monetary theory could be applied to create a Green New Deal. But the issue is MMT only works when you have a sovereign currency. And really, it doesn't work if you're a small country reliant on foreign earnings. So that rules out most of the world, including the Eurozone. This week, we look at how you can tackle a global issue like climate change when only a handful of countries could take part in the Green New Deal. That's this week on the Debunking Economics podcast. So we've been talking about the idea from Randall Wray that we should spend 5% of GDP at least on a Green New Deal funded by modern monetary theory. In other words, the government is creating that money, additional money which is being pumped into the economy. And last time, how we could get the balance right between how that could be money that is spent by the government and whether we can allow the public sector to be involved in this. And towards the end, we were talking about, well, you know, perhaps the easiest way of doing that is that the government basically issues grants, but chops up the project into various parts, and then the private sector can innovate with money which is made available to them from the government, which makes perfect sense, doesn't it, Steve?
Well, it does. I mean, there's two sources of innovation, and this is where, like, Mariana Mazzucato recently won the inaugural, not the Nobel Economics Prize. Mariana's point has been that a huge amount of innovation actually takes place in the government sector, and a large part of neoclassical economic theory has been to pull the wool over people's eyes on this front and say the government is always a bunch of bureaucrats, never do anything creative, best to hand it over to the private sector. That's where innovation occurs. When you take a look at it, one of the most obvious elements of modern technology, without which we couldn't imagine the world in which we live, was created by the government sector, and that's the internet. It was a project of I've forgotten the name of the British scientist who was mainly involved, but at the time he was working for the DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Authority in the American economy.
Are you talking about Berners-Lee?
Berners-Lee, yeah. Now, he was working for DARPA at the time. It was a DARPA-funded project.
Yeah. And
the idea behind it was they wanted to have a way of enabling communications to occur in the event of a nuclear strike. Now, if you have just very direct communication systems, then there's going to be one channel between Europe and America, and one bomb takes that out, and that's the end of communications. They wanted to have the whole web, and that's the whole idea. Rather than breaking a cable, you have a web. You cannot stop the communications being shunted somewhere through the web. So that was the idea of the World Wide Web.
Well, if you look, actually, I mean, all around the world, there's examples of innovation which has really come out of the government sector rather than out of the private sector. In fact, you'd probably argue that most has. If you look at, so for example, Wi-Fi in Australia really came out of the government, didn't it? If you look at space exploration, obviously that started in the government sector. In the UK, when we had British Rail, they were building and designing their own trains rather than just buying them from overseas. So the advanced passenger train, the fastest, Britain was running trains about the same speed it is now. It was doing it in the 1970s through innovation, which was all publicly funded. So most innovation actually, I think, has come from the public sector.
And what I like to combine the arguments of both Mariana Mazzucato at one extreme and Bill Janeway at the other. Bill, by the way, being a similar economic background to Mariana, because he did his PhD under Joan Robinson at Cambridge, and as somebody who's in economics is anything, it's post-Keynesian. So Bill Janeway was one of the entrepreneurs behind the venture capitalists behind the funding, I think, of Compaq. And he said that his argument is that innovation occurs. You get innovation out of the venture capital world because people have large amounts of money they can afford to lose. In other words, it's only people who can afford to lose large amounts of money who can finance major projects, major innovations. They can lose on 9, win on 1, and become a billionaire out of that. But equally, Mariana's point is exactly the same, and this is where it fits in with MMT as well. The government can afford to lose money.
Yeah.
Now, the private sector, you look just at, looking at private corporations, they can't afford to lose money for too long. They'll go bankrupt.
Right. So they can be involved. They could be involved in this Green Deal. They could be involved in the implementation, perhaps. And the government focuses a lot more on research and then chunks out projects for the delivery aspects of it. But the government can only, of course, create money and follow the MMT approach if they are doing it in their own currency and they've got control over their sovereign currency. So it's okay in the UK, it's okay in Australia, it's okay in the United States. It's not okay in the EU and in Euro countries where they don't have control over their own currencies. And it's not okay in smaller countries where they may have their own currency, but it's largely linked to the fluctuations in the US dollar. In fact, possibly even pegged to the US dollar. So this can't apply everywhere. Yeah. And yet the problem is obviously a global problem.
Yep. And then this is, I mean, again, I don't think we're going to get international programs on this scale until it's seen as an existential problem. But yes, initially, if you have a country which is running a trade deficit and therefore needs to be purchasing American dollars to get involved in trade, and the capital goods they're buying to decarbonise their industry also come from overseas, then they're going to be in a very dire way in trying to finance it just using the idea of running a government deficit, because with that causing a current account a deficit as well for importing those foreign capital goods, you're likely to face your currency losing value, and bang, you have a Turkey situation on your hands.
And particularly if that country is, rich in fossil fuel and they can just dig it up and burn it.
Yeah, and this is like the classic instance there is actually Ecuador before the current Lenin Moreno government. But if you go back to under Korea, there was an enormous oil resource discovered in the part of the Amazon basin that's in Ecuador. And Korea and his advisors wanted not to exploit it. They wanted to leave it in the ground. But they said to do that, we have to get payment from the rest of the world to make up for the revenue we'd otherwise gained by exploiting that oil. And they tried. They campaigned for quite some time, and they finally gave it and said, we need the money. We're going to dig up the oil.
But the rest of the world could pay if they can create the money. So how far can you extend this money creation? So if that, in that example, if the United States had said, well, that's all right, we can just create more US dollars. We're going to pay you in US dollars. We'll just create it and pay it to you. What would be the implications of that?
Well, this is, again, I think it's feasible to do it through the US dollar, but I think highly unlikely. I think this is the sort of thing where it isn't just a case of bringing out the New Deal ideas from the 1930s. It's bringing back the idea of the Bancor as well.
Yeah. So create another currency in effect.
Create a currency which, and this was Keynes's idea for the Bretton Woods, was that what became the International Monetary Fund would have been the international clearinghouse for the global currencies. Every country would be issued an invented currency called the Bancor in proportion to the size of their economy. So America would have got the largest allocation, obviously, to begin with. You'd have a fixed exchange rate between domestic currencies and the Bancor. If a country was running a trade deficit and would run out of Bancor, then it would be forced to devalue. But if a country is running a surplus and accumulating the Bancor, two things would happen. One is they'd be taxed on that increase, and the second is the tax itself would be used to finance developing countries. So in that sense, the surpluses we currently have, and Germany was running at 10% of GDP, it's not anymore, but China and Japan running at that order of their GDP in terms of a trade surplus, that under that plan would generate that level of surplus would be counterproductive, because you'd end up paying it in taxes to finance development in the rest of the world. But in this case, we could use that to finance Green New Deal work. So the Bancors would be provided to places like Bangladesh to install carbon neutral.
Right. Well, let's take that. Let's go through that step by step so I fully understand it. Let's use that example of Ecuador, and let's assume that we had the Bancor at that time. So Ecuador's there saying, we've got all this stuff in the ground. We're going to start digging it up and burning it and polluting the planet unless you can pay for us to invest in solar power plants. So the US says, well, okay, we can create some money. We can create US dollars. Well, we're going to convert that to Bancor. What? Take us through step by step how that's going to work.
It would actually have been something like the International Monetary Fund, which would be the IMF has been a very destructive and negative institution in the actual political world in which we've lived, because being controlled by neoclassical economists, they were convinced that government should run a surplus, that they should cut spending, etc. So it's been a destructive institution.
Absolutely. If you're in debt, we'll make it even worse for you, because we'll give you the loan, but we're going to make sure that you.
A a lot of Argentina's problems come out of a combination of a runaway problem followed by.
But you're saying that they in this scenario they should play a central role. Yeah.
In this scenario, they would have been money accumulating at first of all the IMF. Would have had the capacity to create Bancor if it wanted to, if it was actually allowed to by its governing body. And secondly, it'd be accumulating Bancor out of the countries running trade surpluses. So those Bancors would then be, and the specific purpose of the accumulation of Bancor by taxing countries running surpluses was to finance third world development. So Keynes's idea was actually set up pretty much perfectly for what we want to do now. If we want to be able to finance countries like Ecuador rather than drilling up the oil that's sitting there, and they know it's sitting there, leave it sitting there, and instead use the Bancor to buy the technology necessary, firstly, to import solar cells and wind, and secondly, to make their own domestic manufacturing capability. That would have been part of the proposal under Keynes. So again, and I think to some extent, if we do get to the point where we have to, first of all, we realise we have to have an internationally coordinated approach, then we are going to end up going to something like that Bancor proposal some 90 years after it was first put forward.
But that is sounding like world government, isn't it? Where you've got a global currency and you've got a body that's determining how much of that currency is in circulation and which countries are the recipients of it. Hugely open to corruption, but it's also so far from our thinking. I mean, there are people who are very fearful of what you're advocating here, which is it's almost like world government.
Yeah, I know, and this is the ironic thing. A lot of people think it's all a conspiracy to lead towards world government. No, it's a series of huge blunders that are leading in that direction. That's my real concern. You're going to need to treat the planet as one unit at some point, and we've blundered our way there. It isn't a case of all these climate scientists conspiring to create a global government. Although some of the nonsense I read on the conspiracy wing of Twitter is quite hilarious. Knowing the people they think are doing this conspiring, and the lifestyles they lead, and the attitudes they have to humanity in general, they're not doing this conspiring. But the politicians are blundering our way there, because at some point, if we really do realise this is if the Western nations are the ones who first have the enormous crises that warn just how bad this is and know have got to change over dramatically. At the same time, you can't tell the third world you've got to stay at a below the poverty line level of living for most of your people, because otherwise the planet will die. Well, that's not going to go down politically effectively. You've got to think, says, okay, if we're not going to use carbon-based energy sources to catch up with you, we have to use others, and you're going to have to pay for it, and that will be. That's when the world government stuff will start turning up.
Right. But one step at a time. I mean, if the response to the Extinction Rebellion movement right now is that governments were to say, do you know what? We've got an answer to this, which might actually be there's this thing called modern monetary theory, which tells us that we can actually basically run the government's budget in deficit. And we've done it before. I mean, Randall Wray points to the fact that we had during World War II, we had a 25% budget deficit. We didn't have inflation. So we've got the precedent that we can run a fairly hefty deficit before we have to worry about inflation, I should say. So let's do that. The Extinction Rebellion say this is great. The government says marvelous. We're going to have a plan. Let's put a plan into place. Then that's all perceivable in a decade, perhaps. The idea that we then say, but we can only do this in these countries, and we want to extend it. To do that, we've actually got to create a global currency, and then we've got to have a governing body, which is basically going to determine how that currency is created and where it's spent. That's perhaps a step too far. I'm just wondering whether there's a way we can get from individual countries being involved in this to actually having more of a global footprint. And by the way, before you answer that, the one place we've got to overcome as well is countries like Australia, which would lose a mass of fossil fuel revenue. It's clinging on to high heaven because, of course, it's getting foreign earnings from fossil fuel. So even if you were to say, well, the government create money so we can make the world a greener place, they're going to say, well, that's good. We can create our own money, but we're not getting any foreign money coming in because we're not selling fossil fuel anymore.
Yeah, I mean, there's no way this is going to be a peaceful process. I mean, there's going to be conflict galore. And the trouble is, in the meantime, until such time as you realize that it actually is an existential threat, the perception of I'm going to lose out of this is going to dominate anything. And of course, we know how, you and I both know how trivial the Australian debate is on climate change. You know, it's saying we're only 1.5% of the world's climate emissions. Why should we do anything? I saw a great analogy as saying, if you're the first person to see the canoes heading over the waterfall, do you sit there and wait till the biggest guy starts rowing? No, you row like bloody hell to slow the canoe down. But that's not how Australia's thinking. Of course, they still think, you know, there's no waterfall, we can keep on going indefinitely. And there will be massive campaigning against this. And we can see with the reaction to Extinction Rebellion just how powerful that reaction can be until such time as it's seen as an existential threat.
Yeah, ironically, I mean, the UK, even though it's not perfect, is doing a lot more than countries like Australia, isn't it? I mean, we are actually in the UK closing down all our coal-fired power stations in the next few years, whereas Australia's even looking at replacing them with more coal-fired power stations, which makes no sense whatsoever. But I mean, is that? I mean, but without sort of resorting to war or conflict, how do you change a country like Australia? If the Australian government accepted the modern monetary thinking and realised that they could run at a deficit, and bought the idea that climate change is happening, which is, you know, not everyone in the Australian government is convinced of, and they wanted to do things, I'm just wondering how they save the economy in the process. I mean, I guess
they don't. They don't. This is the problem. I mean, there's actually
because they need those foreign earnings because they're not exporting anything,
and because the industrial base of the country has been destroyed under economic policy in the last 30 years. So the most recent issue of the Atlas of Economic Complexity has just come out. I haven't personally read it yet. Of course, I will, but. In that document, Australia's complexity level has fallen by 23 points compared to other countries, and I think now down to just below the level of complexity in terms of its exports of Senegal. I think that just looking at exports alone understates, confuses the issue. It's not as bad as it looks under exports alone. But Australia, if you couldn't export the iron ore and coal and aluminium and so on, there's not much else they can export because they haven't got the industrial base. Right. So that country is going to realise it's much poorer than it thinks it is. And
but it could rebuild that industrial base. And if we're talking about, you know, such a major transformation, we're talking about building stuff that we don't have now and we want it to become smarter and more energy efficient, then there's going to be componentry and intellectual investment that needs to happen, that can happen in places like Australia if they just pull their finger out and get on with it, to export to the rest of the world.
No, you've got to import the knowledge. I mean, I've seen some talk within the Liberal Party in Australia about building a nuclear power station. We haven't got the engineers. We haven't got the physicists. We did have them in the 1950s.
Nice place to live, though. You just offer them, you know, decent housing and a place on the beach, and they will flock there.
To some extent, that's true, but you've still got to finance that. So if you run down your capability, you have to import a large part of those capabilities, and then you're caught back in the same old bind.
No, but you're going to pay them in Australian dollars with money that you've created.
Not when you've got to buy the goods to bring. You bringing the engineers is one thing. Bringing the machine tools, the industrial equipment is a entirely different thing. And initially, if you don't have the capability to make it locally, you're going to have to import it and maybe pull it apart and work out how to make it yourselves, which is what the Chinese did very successfully. But initially, you're going to have to take a huge hit to your standard of living. And the attitude to that is going to be resistance. And the only way you're going to stop them exporting is by not by them voluntarily deciding not to mine the coal and so on. It's by countries refusing to buy it.
Right, but if you look at how information technology has developed, I mean, we have people, you know, all over the world involved in the process involved in making a computer, or, you know, other forms of technology which have a microprocessor sitting at the bottom of it. We've got people building those microprocessors. We've got people building the components, the elements of those microprocessors. We've got people building the machines that those microprocessors are put into. And they're not all in the same country. There's a degree of specialization which is happening here, and couldn't the same thing be happening in the green industry? So we might say, well, okay, Australia can invest in building widget A, which isn't needed now but will be, and it requires some investment in in machinery, but most of it is intellectual property, and we're a smart country, and we can entice people here, and we're going to become the widget A manufacturers for the world.
Well, that's actually part of this like an Australian session to most of the listeners, but on that particular point, Australia was actually the place where what's called amorphous silicon photovoltaic cells were first developed by a guy called Martin Green at the University of New South Wales. He tried to build a local domestic industry for producing solar cells, got no support whatsoever. His leading PhD student went back to China, and guess who was the major person establishing the Chinese solar voltaic industry? So. And now, of course, what that means is China's got the technology for building photovoltaics. That could be transferred. That could be created rather more rapidly in Australia than anything else because of Martin Green's work and a moderate infrastructure there for solar. But if you're talking things like, for example, inventing thorium reactors, I mean, I happen to know a couple of researchers in thorium reactors in Australia as well. But the technology involved in building that is far more developed in countries like Germany, like France. Than it is in Australia. So you'd need to import the stuff. So again, you're going to be, the attitude is going to be, you have a double whammy. First of all, you're not able to make your exports. Secondly, you can't afford the imports. So some countries are going to have to suffer in terms of overall income, and one of them is definitely going to be Australia.
But it could be overcome. I mean, it's not an insurmountable, because they are, a country that can adopt MMT approaches. It can create its own money. The issue is foreign money.
This is one point where I differ with MMT. I disagree over the attitude they have on foreign trade. I think their attitude on government money creation, financial in general, is completely accurate and based on an incontrovertible logic. The argument they have about foreign trade, I think, is based on a farce. The idea that exports are a cost and imports are a benefit. It's a totally different idea. Injected into MMT, I think countries running a trade deficit end up being in a very bad way. And particularly if you saw a country whose exports were cut off, so Australia could no longer export particularly coal, and then had to then create its own domestic industrial base to create the low carbon technology in energy generation technology, they're going to have a double whammy, and they won't be able to do it.
Unless they're creating something which they export, though. If they're creating an alternative, if there's demand there, because countries like
flying marsupial pigs,
or the technology that sits behind flying marsupial pigs. I mean, if the US is saying, well, okay, we're going to increase our GDP, 5% of our GDP is now going to be money which is being spent on this Green New Deal, in the UK and other MMT capable countries are doing the same thing. Then we've got this big expansion in this sector, and so there's a market there. And so there's an opportunity, and Australia can invest in that opportunity because it too can create money to invest in industries. So so your point is, yes, but they're going to need to import stuff, and they're going to need to pay in foreign currencies to import that stuff. Is it going to be worthwhile? And my point is, well, it's at some point it will be, mightn't it?
Well, this is where the Atlas of Economic Complexity again is a very useful resort to say just how realistic is that. We can lift ourselves up by our own bootstraps.
Right.
You have to have the industrial network to be able to build on in the very first instance. So you need the capacity to produce particular types of steel. You need particular processing of trace minerals. You need the microprocessor creating capabilities as well. If they don't exist, then you're behind an import barrier. You've got to import that stuff to begin with. And when you look at the level of complexity, again, back to the Australian point, the level of the complexity of what the economy can produce for export, as shown by that atlas, is about the same level of Senegal. So it's got a long, long way to go before.
Point taken. So they say that the one place that does have that complexity but is held back because it doesn't have the sovereignty of its currency is Europe, isn't it? And then this becomes a huge opportunity, in fact, for Europe to say, well, okay, the euro does need to be a sovereign country. This becomes an argument which, of course, the Brits are against, which is why they're trying to get, even though they're not part of the euro, but it's a more integrated Europe. This becomes an argument for Europe to say, well, okay, it's not only the European Central Bank, we also need a government now as well, which is going to control spending across the whole of the Eurozone, so that in effect the euro is seen as a sovereign currency, so we can create it, so we can then start to pump more money. It's so far away from current EU thinking, all of this. But if they were to shift their thinking, then this is an opportunity, isn't it? Because they have all of those resources, they have that complexity, that mix of industries, and they're in an environment where I think there is an acceptance from the population at large that climate change is something that needs to be tackled. So if they get it right, a huge opportunity for the euro, but that means losing sovereignty for basically 26 or 27 European nations.
Well, they've already given it up by having the euro in the first place.
Yeah,
it means exercising that sovereignty and what that requires is a dramatic increase in the scale of the European government. Yeah. And of course, this comes back to people seeing it all as being a deliberate conspiracy. Now, I think we're blundering towards that situation.
But is that a bad thing necessarily? So 10 minutes ago, we were talking about a world government and how there was going to be mistrust of that situation. But maybe the EU becomes the stepping stone to that, in that the EU could actually, if it did have more centralized control and more sovereignty was given away, then you have a body, whether it's the EU or it's the central bank, but somebody is saying, well, okay, we're going to issue, we're all going to run into fiscal debt now. We're going to create more money so governments can spend, but we have to control that somehow. So we're going to use the knowledge that exists in Germany and the industry that exists in Germany, but we are going to put some of this development for green industries in Greece, because that's where money and investment and jobs are needed. And we're going to do the same in Spain, and we're going, and they start to develop a all of Europe approach. And a lot to say that, there's a lot of benefit from that approach, even though it's counterintuitive for most people who'd see this as centralized meddling.
Yeah, well, and again, if you look back at the Great Depression, we were talking in the last podcast about the Great Depression and the impact of government spending then. Between the Great Depression and the Second World War, the scale of government spending as a percentage of GDP rose by a factor of 4 to 6 for most countries around the world. So you went from the government being maybe 5% of spending to 30% of spending. And that's what we've taken as normal ever since. And if you tried to propose, let's go from 5% of spending to 30% of spending in the 1920s, you would have been shot out of the stadium. So the circumstances, the actual existential circumstances at the time, can mean that what is unthinkable then becomes it just happens. And then after it's happened, it's the real world. You're no longer complaining about an existential change. You've made the existential change. So that is a feasible thing to happen. Like particularly France is extremely advanced in nuclear stations. It's doing some of the work in fusion technology. I'm hoping there's work being done there in thorium, which I think is more likely to work. But you'd want to have some combinations of German and French engineering coming together. You wouldn't see it necessarily as being feasible just in one country on its own. So you do need that pan-European attitude, but that would flip the euro from being a austerity controlling system to a stimulus and infrastructure building system, and that'll be interpreted as a deliberate conspiracy. This is always Schäuble's plan, anything but. It's the accidental outcome of the ignoring the climate until the threat is too great.
Well, the system's there. It's just the people and the attitudes have got to change. And you look at the outgoing governor of the European Central Bank. He's been talking about modern monetary theory. This is
one of the things I find this incredibly annoying, because the classic statement is very hard to get somebody to understand something when they're salary dependent on not understanding it. I've spoken to Vitor Constanza, who's one of the ex-members of the board. Draghi I haven't spoken to, but I've noticed in both cases, Constanza, though he was a bit flexible, was still defending the whole Maastricht Treaty, focus on controlling government spending and so on. When he leaves, bang, he starts saying we should effectively abolish the Maastricht Treaty, which I completely agree with. You have people in positions of power who are constrained by those positions of power to not say what they know is necessary until they retire. Then things are replaced by somebody else who continues the same situation. The only thing I can say in favour of it, I think the breaking point is improving, because if Draghi's coming out and saying we've got to have, we have to have fiscal stimulus now, the monetary system hasn't worked, then there's some potential for the incoming replacement, though that is, of course, Lagarde, to say, well, let's start turn from being a control on government spending to reduce it to a control on government spending to increase it. But then they've got to change the Maastricht Treaty. So the forest of things are put in our way of responding sensibly and rapidly to this, it's ridiculous how big the forest is.
But but not insurmountable. Imagine, I'm trying to be optimistic behind all of this because I feel because maybe the
I was having a problem. Yeah?
Maybe the time exactly. You don't recognise me. Who is this man I'm talking to, and what have you done with Phil Dobbie? But the opportunity if modern monetary theory is accepted, say over the next decade, and the United States, which are overspending anyway, but you had another leader in there who actually recognised that climate change was an issue, so use government debt for good rather than for evil, for saving the planet rather than lining the pockets of the wealthy. And you had Europe taking a more centralised approach and expansionary rather than disciplining people who overspend. And you had the UK on board too. And then you have, of course, obviously countries like China, which are definitely creating their own currency to invest. And are moving in this direction. So we're told India presumably could be doing the same thing. You've got a large chunk of the world covered. You could have an approach which has been taken by all the major players, and then surely for some of them to say, well, okay, we can also therefore spend money in smaller countries as well to invest in infrastructure using our own currency. Again, it's not going to be a big issue because it's going to be small fry compared to the amount of money they're spending in their own countries. We could have a coordinated approach on a world scale, couldn't we?
Yeah, we could. I think we potentially will start moving at the direction over the next 10 years because the political pressure that Extinction Rebellion is manifesting is a sign of a shift in attitudes, in favour ultimately of doing work to reduce the level of carbon in the economy much more rapidly than economists have been arguing is necessary, and much more rapidly than countries haven't been doing. They're going in the opposite direction. So it is a potential to push it through. I think it'll set the ground stage as for what's necessary. It won't be in itself sufficient because, again, the scale of what's necessary is enormous. And also, I think there's no way that we can go forward without reducing the size of the economy globally.
Yeah.
And I think that's inevitably going to happen. We'll be fighting tooth and nail to prevent it. So it won't happen in anything like a peaceful fashion. But this to me is the beginning of a process, and certainly MMT will get a Guernsey as the way that this can all be financed.
And I wonder whether, just a final point then, whether Europe is actually where all of this is going to start, because there's for two reasons. One is Europe has the issue that it's got some very wealthy nations and some countries that are struggling, and so MMT thinking applied there could actually say, well, okay, maybe Greece doesn't need to pay back their debt. Maybe we should be creating money and spending it there. That's point one, and that realization is certainly going to shift thinking. But secondly, I think out of anywhere in the world, if you're looking at countries where there are more concerned citizens about the environment, it's not Australia, is it? It's not the United States. It's in Europe,
and it's also China.
And China. Yeah.
Yeah. So those are the countries where you're likely to see dramatic
China progress. Because they're having difficulty breathing. But I mean, Europe's drawing that conclusion even without that day-to-day problem.
Yeah, and that combination means you're less likely to see the innovation taking place in Europe and China rather than taking place in America or that backwater in the Southern Pacific called Australia.
Yeah, well, there we are. There's a thought for investors about where to put their money in this new technology. Good to talk, Steve.
Good, mate.
We'll catch you again soon. Thanks.
Okay.
If this is the way forward, I wonder how long it is going to take for the world's politicians and economists to catch on to it. That's it for this week. Another Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen next week. I'm Phil Dobbie. Thanks for listening. If you've enjoyed this podcast, then please share it with your friends, like it on YouTube, and subscribe to this channel.